This week on Dialogue, in search of political leadership. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests this week are Aaron Miller and Stefan Richter. Aaron Miller is a former Middle East negotiator for Republican and Democratic administrations, having served as an advisor to 6 secretaries of state. He's currently a public policy scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Stefan Richter is the publisher and editor-in-chief of The Globalists, the daily online magazine on the global economy, politics, and culture, which he founded and launched in January 2000. He's also president of the Globalist Research Center. Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue. Aaron, I want to begin with a little historical context for our discussion. I know you've been working on this book about Can America Have Another Great President? Tell us what your research is indicating about the nature of political leadership in America historically.
It's contradictory. I mean, in some respects, greatness is very much in the eye of the beholder. 8 out of the last 12 years of Gallup polls put Jack Kennedy among the 3 or 4 great presidents in the views of 1,000 Americans polled. I mean, Jack Kennedy was president for 1,033 days. Mm-hmm. Is greatness really appropriate? Reagan's defenders and proponents, on the other hand, would put him in the greatness category. My view is that greatness, and what I'm discovering is greatness may well be in the eye of the beholder, but there are ways to measure it across space and political time. And in fact, you can construct, however controversial, a definition of it and situate it in an American context. It may be different in Britain, it may be different in France, it may be different in Israel, but we have a unique sort of conception of what constitutes greatness. And I'm trying to create a standard for that.
I'm going to ask you to hold that thought for a second, and we'll come back to this whole notion of a definition. But first, I want to play a little word association with you, Stefan. When you think of political leadership in a historical context, what names come to mind? Are there people that instantly you would identify as great leaders?
Well, for the 20th century, which is more relevant for our audience alive today, I would say Winston Churchill, Gorbachev, people like that, certainly who were transformative leaders. There's then Mandela and others, but there was always something rather stunning and unexpected about them, and little that could be predicted. People who really changed the world by really mixing up their part of the world in a manner that really helped the global agenda move ahead by leaps and spades. And without Gorbachev having had the guts to basically say, our balance sheet is such that we need to reshape this, nothing would have happened in the end.
What if you were answering those polls that Aaron referenced about American presidents where JFK keeps coming out near the top of the list?
It's a question of mythology. It's the American culture has a very different approach to the concept of leadership. I would say there is something about this being the only undefeated nation among major nations on earth today that still combines leadership with greatness. If you look at anybody else, Japan, Russia, Italy, Germany, France, China, India, whether by their own war-making or by colonialization or so, all of them have been defeated. So for them, the idea of leadership and greatness is a highly relative one, and it's very different in the American context.
That's your definition, and you say there are things that are different about America. What are these things?
First of all, it's an interesting idea, but if you look at history, America, obviously a relatively young and new nation, doesn't really measure up. It's the Europeans that define the notion by attaching literally the word great to so many of their leaders. Frederick the Great, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Charlemagne. Americans, on the other hand, are, because of our creed and our individualism and our anti-authoritarian character, are very uncomfortable with greatness. We devour our political leaders. We don't worship them.
Has that always been the case? That's certainly true today.
I think even among the 3 great American presidents, 1 in each century. And we've only had 3 undeniably great presidents. Washington in the 18th, Lincoln in the 19th, and FDR in the 20th, they were all pilloried. If you think Obama is criticized, the kinds of things people were saying even about George Washington, let alone Abraham Lincoln, who was described as a stooge and a guerrilla. So I think that the issue of greatness Stefan's right, it has to do with transformation, transformative leaders, but it also has to do with transaction. Greatness implies a capacity to confront an unanticipated, perhaps, crisis of extraordinary proportion, to lead the nation through it, and then to transform the nation in one particular dimension critical to its history, social, economic, constitutional. And we trivialize greatness. Have a great day, it was a great movie, he's a great guy. We've trivialized it to the point of irrelevance, which is part of the problem we have today in wanting to invest in our political leaders, which I might add, we don't.
Both of you describe these extraordinary circumstances that allow us to measure greatness in some ways. It brings up that old paradox about is it a function of the times or the person? Is greatness something we assign in retrospect after someone has navigated through rough waters?
Well, to Aaron's point, Europeans haven't called anybody great in about 2 centuries. The United States has been in existence for about that period of time, which might explain why we still ask the question here. I think there's a broader question, though. So my answer to your question would be neither. Circumstances, greatness, and so on. It's the structural setup in this country is of such a nature that you basically can't be great anymore, because especially in this town, in Washington, D.C., everything is organized so that you paralyze the other side. You look at the current incident in Japan, and all of a sudden, in next to no time, you had coal companies advertising that, you know, coal is great, and if we want to lead the world, we need to go for coal, and there's clean coal, as if such a thing existed. This city is organized from the Congress through all the lobbies in a perfect manner so that you basically can't get anything done. And that's one of the biggest questions that I have, including on things like the budget that we all talk about. The United States is remarkable in the sense that it does not have a finance minister. It has a Treasury Secretary who can propose something, but because of the non-parliamentary system, the presidential system, there's a real question as to whether the buck really stops with anybody.
Well, the gridlock you describe, if I could use that shorthand, the usual response to that is, well, we need some leadership to get us out of that.
Well, but Stefan has made the point that greatness is a function of circumstance. The founders created, it isn't the city so much as the history. The founders purposefully, willfully created a system to constrain greatness because they feared the king, they feared the royal governors on one hand, and they feared the public, the mob, the people on the other. So they created a system which is an open invitation to struggle. The only way that greatness appears in our form of government is when the system is forced to respond, when people are forced to look toward leadership. And under what circumstances does that happen? It only happens under circumstances that I would describe to you as nation-encumbering crisis. Without nation-encumbering crisis cometh the hour, cometh the man, or alternatively, not yet, the woman. So this, I think, is a critical point. We face in the 21st century tremendous systemic and systematic crises in this country. Deficit and debt reduction, global warming, a dysfunctional educational system. And yet, they're not acute. They're not so exigent that it forces the political system to respond to crisis, as the other three, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, responded to imminent danger and imminent challenge.
All those points are very well taken, but going back to history and leadership, l'État, c'est moi, famous French king, the state, that's who I am, and I am the state. We live in a society where government is systematically vilified. What is government in the age of democracy? I would say, le gouvernement, c'est nous. Government is us, all the citizens. So if we vilify government, we make the function of leadership by itself at least that much more difficult. And it is one of the other interesting contrasts that nowhere else in the world that I'm aware of is government as much vilified as in U.S. society, where it is almost a pejorative. Government bureaucrats, not civil servants.
Well, Ronald Reagan, government is the problem.
That's where it started, but it's it's gone on since that time. But the problem really is, if we don't trust ourselves as the collective, and if we don't believe that civil servants are there to act on our behalf and organize all these complex challenges, then by definition we have a leadership problem, because we're believing all of a sudden in the Deus ex machina, the godlike president who can fix it. I would argue that's an impossibility if the broader apparatus of government does not tackle these challenges, because, as Aaron pointed out, these challenges are all incredibly complex. And unless we have the whole apparatus work at it all the time, we don't get anywhere. And the supposition here is, let the bureaucrats not work on it.
No followers, no leaders.
Leadership requires followership. And not, we're talking about leadership in the service of honorable ambition, not leadership in the service of cruelty and violence and genocide and racism. Yes, leadership requires followers, and the great leaders were intuitors. They were intuitors of the national mood. The problem we face today is there is no national mood. There is no common national narrative. And I think this is a huge problem, in part because whatever crises we face today are not our grandfathers' crises. They are not nation encumbering. They do not force Americans to relate systemically in a common fashion.
And you're saying that that narrative can't be supplied by a leader, it has to be supplied by an acute circumstance.
It is, in this system, I won't speak for the Europeans, the Asians, or certainly not for the Middle Easterners, but in this system, because of the nature of the constraint on power, it is shared and separated powers, which, as Stefan has pointed out, is an RX very often for paralysis and stalemate. The system only moves, it only responds by intention of the framers to national emergency and national exigency. And that, it seems to me, is the real problem. There's a wonderful line from Richard IV. It was one of Jack Kennedy's favorite. Hotspur or Glendower, one or the other asks the other, "I can summon up the spirits from the vasty deep." And the other replies, "But so can any man. The question is, do they come when you call?" That's the question.
You know, I almost wonder, it's almost like pop music. You sell more albums when you die, when you're sort of the martyred musician. Elvis becomes greater in death than he was in life. Is greatness something we assign after the fact? Can it be possible to have a living great leader, or do you have to be dead, and we decide that historically?
Well, there used to be a rule that you can't have a street or an airport or anything named after you while you were still alive. We dispensed with that rule. But I think this greatness thing is not the challenge that we're facing right now, because it is rather, we've had a mega crisis. U.S. unemployment is at such a structural level like it has never been before. The prospects for moving it down from 9.5% are very uncertain. We face a society where 50-year-old men and up may never find employment again, which used to be Europe's problem. So,
but that's not a clear galvanizing narrative in the way, say, Nazism on the march was.
Or 25% unemployment in 1932. This is not a crisis. People don't feel there are no bread lines. There's no prospective violence. Unemployment hasn't reached 25%. Think about what FDR was dealing with. You have pockets of prosperity in this country. You don't have the kind of nation-encumbering crisis that will shock the system. If you did, I would argue, you'd have a different kind of Washington.
Is the problem you described, Stefan, too diffuse?
It's a different definition of crisis. As Aaron pointed out, this constitutional setup is we shall only legislate when there's a real crisis. Now, there's a big debate whether the crisis has been big enough or not for all sorts of things, employment programs and so on. But the real issue is, what can we do as a country? And the question then is, in a political system, and I hate to throw in campaign finance, but you have a perfect feedback loop, right? If the president was financed largely by Wall Street, there are those who are not cynics who can then point out, no wonder that he wasn't particularly tough on the financial industry. There are others who will say, well, even if he had wanted to be tough, it wasn't possible because the Congress wouldn't have let him. And so we come to a very sincere differentiation between the U.S. and the rest of the world. As Aaron points out, only existential mega crises, sort of 5 minutes before we're all dead, are accepted as a nation-moving event in his definition and probably in a correct interpretation of where the United States stands as a society. My position is that that's not just an extreme, that's almost a suicidal way of organizing society, because complex challenges keep adding up on all the fronts, on the environment, on finance, on employment, all these things. And unless you start hammering away at it, chiseling away at it every single day, you're not going to get anywhere. And that's why I take the position it's not that much the big leadership as society coming together and working not across purposes. And that's the fundamental question. The U.S. constitutional system, the U.S. presidential system, is set up in an extremely adversarial manner. And is that in a non-parliamentary manner, where in a parliamentary system, I can throw that in for a second, the head of the executive branch always has the majority in Parliament. You look at the British government right now, Cameron and so on, within 3 months they had more enacted in terms of their agenda because of the unity of parliamentary leadership and executive branch leadership, as is in any parliamentary system, which is almost anywhere in the world, than Barack Obama or any president who's extremely successful could have had after 2 terms.
Has the complexity that Stefan describes and the nature of the problem that Stefan describes made this system of American governance flirting with obsolescence?
No. You look at the last Congress. It was one of the most productive legislative sessions in American history. Some people would argue that it was not as productive as Johnson's 2 civil rights legislation, Medicare and Medicaid, or FDR's first 100 days.
And yet lack of progress on mounting problems,
right.
Energy policy.
All of that is true. All of that is true because of certain changes in the nature of the political system. I'm arguing, in answer to my own question, can America have another great president? The answer, I'm arguing no, and I will go further. I said we don't want another great president.
Is it too many eggs in one basket? Is it all about the president? Is that the problem, or is that a big part of the problem?
No, in fact, I think.
Well, where do we look for leadership?
Well, now you're asking a question that has to do with what constitutes leaders, CEOs, managers of baseball teams, heads of organizations, Congress.
But they can be essentially niche leaders. When we're talking about national movements, the type of transformative leadership that you described, where can we find that other than only executive?
I would argue only through accidents of history. You can be God and be unsuccessful if the circumstances aren't right. There's a beautiful story about a new CEO who went to his chairman of the board and said, "This is a great new car. This will make the future of the company and make me look good." And the seasoned businessman said, "Young man, ambitious CEO, you don't understand. This car that you designed will make your successor's career, given the lag times in the industry. Your fate has been spoken for by what the last guy did. If you think he did a terrible job, you're in for a tough time." That's similar in politics, and that is a tremendous challenge.
We don't want great presidents, because greatness, in my judgment, means nation-encumbering crisis or calamity. We don't want them. We can't have them.
So we want a steward during good times.
No, we want good presidents.
Oh, good, not great.
We want presidents who are able to function and to create a basis for political action short of national calamity. We want to preempt the national tragedy or calamity. And you have moments in American history in which you didn't have nation-encumbering crisis. Johnson was an incredibly effective domestic political leader. What did Johnson have? He had years of legislative experience. He had Kennedy's assassination. He had a country that for a brief moment, before it unwound in the institution-breaking cycle of the 60s, really was up for change. May have felt guilty, indebted to the Kennedy legacy. Johnson took advantage of that. Now, he had Vietnam, which dragged him down and prevented him from being what he wanted to be, which was a great president.
I want to spend a moment focusing on what Johnson didn't have. The internet, blogs, 24/7 cable channel, news channels. Are we in an era where it makes it, all these factors make it even more impossible for great leadership to emerge, because now you're torn down almost before you begin to ascend?
I would argue absolutely. I mean, I think while the media can work to the advantage of a skillful president, and it has, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, it also can drag that president down. Barack Obama goes on David Letterman? No. Jay Leno. He's asked a question. Somehow he loses the sense of where he is or who he is. He says, I bowled 139. It's good enough for the Special Olympics. He finds himself on the phone the next morning apologizing to Tim Shriver. Why do I need a president that goes on Jay Leno? I don't want to banter with a late night comedian.
Plays the saxophone.
And yet he must go on Jay Leno.
But it's also a tearing down society. And that's where I come back to the issue not just of leadership, but you also need to combine that with the notion of American optimism and why that existed. And what we tend to forget, while it's described as a default position of the American people, it was also in the time when government really worked, where Johnson was sort of the late stage of it, 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on, was that the United States had an economic position by default of other countries being really stupid, Europe having torn itself apart, Japan, Russia, China, India, and so on. It had a material position to pacify a lot of otherwise virulently aggressive domestic interests and setting them off against each other. We don't have that transaction margin anymore, so that, I mean, we try to have it, and that's why the budget deficit keeps on rising. But I come back to the point that unless we have much more limited expectations of these godlike figures that can do it for us. I mean, president gets elected, right? For 100 days, he's supposed to work wonders.
Fix the world.
Journalists make careers on who was the biggest sucker-upper to the candidate. And as soon as the guy gets elected, the national sport becomes who's Brutus, who kills our Caesar.
I'm wondering, have we also changed on a deeper level, where you've invoked mythology and gods? In a myth-based society, it's vertical. Gods and elders of the tribe and followers eventually. We've become this sibling society, as some have called it, where everything is horizontal. So no one grants anyone any authority, any expertise, any right to lead.
I think there's something to that, but every presidential election, I start off my book by telling the story. The morning after Obama was elected, I could not find a Washington Post or a New York Times in downtown Washington. This had never occurred to me. It never happened to me before.
What does that say to you? What is that a sign of?
It means that Americans cannot help, in part because of their own conception of presidential greatness, in part because they cannot relate to 535 different human beings in a Congress, or 9 Sphinx-like oracles who happen to sit on the Supreme Court. The media makes the presidency, the man, his wife, his dogs, his comings and goings, his exercise routines, a national pastime. We're trapped. And Stefan is absolutely right. Like used cars or computers, if they don't perform after 48 years, we get rid of them. That's the basic contradiction, that we expect too much of them, we worship them, and then we tear them down.
We might not even give them 48 years, it might be 100 days.
And considering that we label ourselves sort of the oldest democracy in action by various forms, we treat our presidents as the royals we never had. We assign omnipotence to the president that under our system of government he or she can never execute, no matter what party. And I'm concerned that given this setup, that we're eventually going to lose hope, because we need to compare ourselves against one thing, not greatness, but the potential of American society. And if we look and compare to how our political system in the broadest sense performs compared to the potential of American society, I think then we have severe reason to be highly disappointed, because we're falling short every single day. And that's, I think, our biggest malperformance act.
This may be challenging, gentlemen, but can you give us any reason for hope in this arena of political leadership? What can you say in our remaining few minutes that you can identify as hopeful trends or some possibilities?
I'm not I believe in American exceptionalism, but exceptionalism that stops at the water's edge. Oh no, I believe that the gap between who we are and who we can be is a gap that can be bridged, because in essence we have three things that no other nation on earth has and will never have. Number one, we have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south and fish to our east and west. We have a degree of physical security and detachment, even with 9/11, that puts us in a very favorable position. Second, even though we waste them, we have enormous economic abundance and natural resources still in this country, in huge physical space. And finally, we have a political system, unlike any in the world, that is based on the primacy of the individual. A system that can produce a Barack Obama and a Sarah Palin both in the same time, with both being legitimate, authoritative, authentic expressions of the American system. Those three things offer us tremendous advantage if we harness them into a political system that can actually work.
Final thoughts, Stefan?
If we do that without ever using the word exceptionalism, because that's the Hail Mary pass to never doing anything, I think we need to, just like we talked that leadership requires followership, so does a good future for the American people require a sense of normalcy and not exceptionalism, so that we understand we're just like many other people on earth. We have better objective circumstances, but subjectively we need to make more of it. And 9/11 is a nice thing, but the rest of the world, not having all these not friendly neighbors, has a far bigger reason to focus on the challenges ahead, because you can't travel in a train or be in a car for 1 or 2 hours in most of these countries before you have to compare yourself. How do these guys fix their healthcare system, fix their retirement system, and all of these things? These are all vital inputs in a societal process of changing, of permanent change, so the society's ability to change, that we're lacking. And I think throwing in exceptionalism at that moment is almost a death wish, because while we may have these objective circumstances, subjectively we need to pretend we don't, because otherwise we don't move ahead.
Gentlemen, thank you for a fascinating discussion. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.